Hi, my name is Dan and I'm one of the DT evangelists here at Digital-Tutors. In this video, we're going to look at a question from one of our users, JBeezy, on a couple different alternatives to using a mental ray depth pass. So to illustrate this, I have a very simple scene set up here. If I were to go ahead and render this out just to see what we're working with right now, we can see that I don't have any depth of field in my scene. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, one way that we can get depth of field into our scene is by actually attaching a lens to our camera. So if I were to select my camera here, open up the attribute editor. Now if we scroll down, we'll find under mental ray the ability to add a lens shader. Now right now I already have an exposure lens here. So how can I go ahead and plug in another lens? Well, right underneath this lens shader option, there's actually another lens shader dial down where we can actually go ahead and attach additional lenses to our camera. So if I go ahead and hit create here, let's go to the lenses section and attach a physical lens depth of field. So now with this attached, we want to come in and find out what a good plane value is in order to determine what is in focus. So the plane is going to be what is in focus, and then the distance from the camera to determine what's in focus, and then the radius is exactly how much depth of field gets applied. So to determine the depth or the distance of this object from the camera, let's go ahead and select it. Come up to display, heads up display, and turn on the object details. We can see here that this object is 7.427 Maya units away, directly in the center at the pivot. So I can come back in and enter this in. Now we'll want to make sure that this stays a negative value, and this will be 7.427 just to get it directly in the center. Now go ahead and say bump up the radius quite a bit, so we'll get quite a bit of depth of field here just so we can see the effect that this lens is having on our render. Okay, great. So this is how our depth of field looks once it's rendered out. We can definitely see we're getting some of the depth of field effect where the center is here in focus. But we also notice that our render time here has increased pretty significantly by attaching this depth of field lens to the actual camera. So while this method doesn't require any compositing, the render time does increase significantly, and if we wanted to get rid of some of this graining here by bumping up the anti-aliasing samples, that would only increase our render time even more. So then what happens if we render out say something that takes a couple hours to render, and then at the end we decide that we want to change the depth of field effect? Well, we'd have to come in and actually re-render the entire image again, and that can get really time consuming just for making some changes. So for that reason, I personally prefer not using this method of getting a depth of field effect, but instead I prefer to render out a depth of field pass and then composite the depth of field look in post. So I'm going to come in and let's go ahead and delete this guy. So I'll come in, select my camera, and come in and delete this lens shader here. Now there's a couple different ways that we can get a depth of field pass out of Maya, and one of those definitely is to use a mental ray depth of field pass in here. But let's take a look at an alternative to that. What we can actually do is use a luminance depth layer, and this is actually a method that was pretty common before the passes system in Maya was integrated in. So to do that, we come into our render layers. I'm going to come in and create a new render layer. I want to make sure that I have everything on the render layer, so just right click on it and go into copy layer. This will be my luminance depth layer. Okay, so with that created, once we have our layer selected, go into the layers here and open up the attributes for that layer. And we'll find our preset. So if we just click on this, we'll find one of the presets is actually for luminance depth. So basically what Maya has done here is it's gone in and set up some layer overrides along with this surface shader here, and hooked in a few different nodes in order to create the luminance depth. So if we were to render this out right now, we can see, well, by default, it's completely white. And this actually has to do with the way that this is set up. The min and max values here, it's trying to get the values from the render camera. But personally, I usually find that when I'm using this particular render layer, I get the best results by coming in here and breaking these connections of the old min and old max, and then setting these values manually. So I'll usually start with something like maybe 0.1 and 75. And the values actually may vary depending on your scene size, but usually this is a pretty good starting point, and you can kind of tweak it from there to work for your particular project. But if we render this out now, we can see we're definitely getting some of our depth values in here. If we also notice, we're kind of getting some faceted looks. Well, part of setting up the Luminance depth preset is that Maya sets a render override of using the Maya software renderer. And since on this particular object I'm using the smooth mesh preview, the Maya software renderer does not support that, so we can come in and just simply switch this to metal ray. And we can see in the resulting render, we're definitely getting a much smoother look here. So this was before and after. If we also notice, it actually kind of changed up our value some. So we could come in and tweak these a little bit more to get whatever sort of look we want. But I'll just stick with this here. So let's come in and set up a name for these files just before I batch render. So I'll just go ahead and right click and set this to be the render layer name, and I'll come in and maybe switch this to something like a target. I just kind of prefer to work with targets. There's no doesn't really make a huge difference since we're not really dealing with any alphas or dealing with 32-bit images in this particular case, like we would if we were dealing with a metal ray depth pass. But I'll just go in there and set that. Let's come in and do a batch render now. So if we were to batch render this out. All right, so our rendering has completed here. So if we go ahead and open up Photoshop, we see we have our two layers here. So this would be our beauty, and this would be our luminance depth. So if we bring both of these in order to get this depth of field effect, we can use this luminance depth layer. So I'm just going to go in and hit Control A in order to select the entire image, hit Control C in order to copy this, and now we want to come in and paste this into this image. But for the sake of creating a actual lens blur, we're going to be using the lens blur filter. So if we open up this filter here, let me go ahead and resize this so we can kind of see this a little bit easier. We can see that we're going to have a source. So we can either get a source from the layer mask or the alpha channel in the image. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and let's go ahead and apply this luminance depth layer as the layer mask for this layer here. The reason I personally prefer to use that particular method is because then we can have those applied to the actual layer and just kind of see it a little bit easier. So if we come in and we want to first make sure that this layer is unlocked. So I'm just going to hold down Alt and double click on it in order to unlock this. And once it's unlocked, we have the ability to create our layer mask. So we can create our layer mask. We want to make sure that the actual layer mask is selected. And if we open up the channels here, we can turn on the visibility for this layer mask and then just hit Control V in order to paste in the luminance depth that we copied from the other image. So we can see we have this, and we're kind of seeing some transparency here, but that's perfectly normal. So now if we come back into our RGB channel and go ahead and deselect everything. So now we're ready to actually create the depth of field effect here in Photoshop. So we can come into Filter, Blur, and Lens Blur, and give it a second to kind of give us a rendered preview of this. If you find this is kind of running slow, you can always uncheck this preview here, but I usually prefer to keep it on, that way I can kind of see what I'm working with. We have the source set as the layer mask, which is perfectly fine because that's the way we had it set up. So we'll notice that we're getting this depth of field effect here. We can increase the radius in order to get more blur. Let it kind of work for a little bit there in order to render this out. But we also want to make sure that we set our source point. So that's going to be this focal distance. Now we can either adjust this here with this slider, or a very easy way of adjusting this. If you notice when I move my mouse over this image, I get this little crosshair. If we simply just left click somewhere on the image, Photoshop will automatically adjust this blur focal distance in order to match wherever I've clicked here on the image. So we can see if I were to, for example, click way in the back, we're going to get this really low focal distance, and this is going to look really blurry. Or if we click up here in the front, we're going to get a little bit of a higher value. And we notice that the back here is getting blurred out just slightly. And once again, we can always come in and kind of increase that to increase the depth of field effect. So that's a look at a couple different alternatives to using the mental ray depth pass. So now we've applied that, we can go ahead and just go delete this layer here, or the layer mask, and we can see we get that depth of field effect on the back of our image the way we had it applied. Now if you do end up wanting to work with an actual mental ray depth pass instead of one of these alternatives, that's perfectly fine. But if you do want to learn some more advanced compositing techniques with that depth pass, I'd really recommend checking out the Advanced Compositing Workflows with Maya and Toxic course.